Get on the ground. Get on the ground now." The black woman was slammed face first into scorching asphalt, her designer heels flying off as Officer Malcolm drove his knee into her spine. The metal handcuffs were cutting into her wrists so hard, you could see blood starting to pool under the steel. "You people always think you're above the law," he snarled, his spit hitting the back of her neck as his partner ripped through her purse like he was searching for buried treasure. Driving around in stolen cars, thinking nobody's gonna notice. She could barely breathe with his full weight crushing down on her, but somehow, she managed to stay calm. Stay composed. What these officers didn't know, what they could never imagine in their wildest dreams, was that the woman they were brutalizing on this public street had a badge buried in her wallet that was about to turn their entire world upside down. Before we start this story, if you believe no one should be discriminated against because of their skin color, then hit that subscribe button right now and tell us where you're watching from. Only those that support discrimination won't subscribe. Have you ever been completely underestimated because of how you looked? Share your experience in the comments. Because what happened next, when the black woman finally revealed what was really in her wallet, showed exactly what happens when people's assumptions come crashing down around them. The black woman, Joan Washington, was 34 years old, born and raised in Detroit by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on their table. Her mama cleaned office buildings at night and worked retail during the day, coming home exhausted, but never too tired to help with homework. She used to tell Joan, "You're gonna have to work twice as hard to get half as much, but don't you ever let that stop you from being great." Joan joined the FBI 12 years earlier because she believed in something. She believed in justice, in the system, in the idea that badges and laws actually meant something. She thought if she worked hard enough, if she was good enough, if she proved herself over and over again, she could make a difference. She specialized in undercover work because she discovered she had a gift for becoming invisible, for blending into communities where people would never expect to find a federal agent. Her colleagues called her Ghost because she could disappear into any situation, any background, any identity. She could become whoever she needed to be to get the job done. What they didn't understand, what they could never understand, was that being a black woman in America meant she'd been undercover her entire life. She'd been code switching since she was 5 years old, adapting her voice, her mannerisms, her entire personality, just to survive in spaces that weren't built for people who looked like her. The irony wasn't lost on her that her greatest qualification for this job was the exact same thing that had her pinned to that pavement. She was an expert at reading rooms, at knowing when she wasn't wanted, at making herself smaller so other people felt comfortable. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated, dismissed, and judged before she even opened her mouth. But none of that had prepared her for what started 8 months before this incident. She was assigned to Operation Clean Sweep, a joint task force targeting the Riverside drug distribution network. This wasn't just any case. This was a multi-million-dollar operation that had been flooding communities with fentanyl for years. Her cover identity was Rachel Thompson, a pharmaceutical sales rep with connections to pain clinics. Perfect backstory for someone who might have access to prescription drugs. She rented a luxury apartment in Riverside Heights, started driving a BMW, bought expensive clothes, and became the kind of woman who could move in those circles without raising suspicion. She spent weeks building relationships with the wives and girlfriends of dealers, going to their book clubs, their yoga classes, their wine tastings. She laughed at their jokes, complimented their designer handbags, and slowly worked her way into their inner circle. Her primary target was Vincent Torres, the operation's kingpin, but he was notoriously paranoid about new faces, so she focused on getting close to his girlfriend Monica, a 28-year-old former beauty queen who loved to gossip and had access to Vincent's operation. They became genuine friends, or at least Rachel and Monica did. Joan almost forgot sometimes that she was playing a role. The local police weren't supposed to know about their operation. That was the whole point. They suspected there was a leak in the department, someone feeding information to Torres about upcoming raids and investigations. Joan's job was to get close enough to identify the dirty cops while gathering evidence on the drug network itself. For months, everything was perfect. Monica trusted her completely, started sharing details about Vincent's business, his connections, his operations. Joan was getting intel that would take down not just Torres, but his entire network. She thought she was being careful, thought her cover was bulletproof. She was wrong. 3 weeks earlier, things started feeling off. Monica became distant, asking weird questions about Joan's background that she'd never asked before. Dealers she'd been building relationships with suddenly stopped returning calls. The easy access she'd cultivated over months just vanished overnight. Then the week before, Joan noticed a police cruiser parked outside her apartment complex 3 days in a row. Different shifts, same car number, 247. She started varying her routes, changing her schedule, taking different exits, but the surveillance was obvious. Someone was watching her, and they weren't even trying to hide it. The day before the incident, Monica finally admitted what Joan had suspected. "Rachel," she said, her voice shaking, "some people are saying you're not who you claim to be. Vincent's getting paranoid about new faces, and your name keeps coming up in conversations." Joan's blood ran cold. She knew her cover was blown, but she couldn't figure out how. She'd been so careful, so methodical. She called her handler, Agent Davis, and told him she needed an immediate extraction. "Give it 24 hours, he said. "We're too close to Torres to pull you now. Just lay low. Don't do anything that looks suspicious." A few days ago, she had successfully been able to clone Torres's phone using Monica, and ultimately discovered a mole in the police force helping him. Her mission was now to discover who the police officer was, so she had to remain in the operation. That morning, she did the most normal thing she could think of. She went grocery shopping. She figured if she was being watched, she'd look like exactly what she claimed to be, a pharmaceutical sales rep, buying organic produce and expensive wine. She never imagined that a simple trip to Whole Foods would end with her face down on asphalt, being called "you people" by a cop who thought he knew exactly what kind of person she was. Joan was driving back from Whole Foods, her back seat literally filled with organic kale, quinoa, and free-range chicken, the kind of groceries Rachel Thompson would buy, when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. 2 patrol cars. Her heart immediately started racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. She pulled over immediately, placing both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, just like her mother taught her when she was 16 years old. Officer Malcolm approached her window with an aggressive swagger that told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. No friendly "good morning" or "do you know why I stopped you?" Just a harsh demand: license and registration. No explanation for the stop, no reason given. She handed over her Rachel Thompson documents, the cover ID that had passed every background check for 8 months, that had fooled banks, landlords, and drug dealers. But Malcolm stared at that license for what felt like an eternity, turning it over in his hands like he was examining evidence. Then he walked back to his patrol car, and she could see him on the radio, animated, pointing at her vehicle. He was talking to someone. And it wasn't just dispatch. This conversation was too intense, too personal. When he came back, he had his partner with him, a younger officer who looked uncomfortable but wasn't brave enough to question what was happening. "Step out of the car," Malcolm ordered, his hand resting on his weapon. That's when Joan knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't a routine traffic stop. This was targeted. This was planned. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice as calm and professional as possible, even though her pulse was hammering in her ears. Malcolm's response made her blood turn to ice. "The problem is that you're driving a stolen vehicle." Her mind started racing. The BMW was registered to Rachel Thompson, purchased through legitimate FBI channels, with paperwork that would stand up to any scrutiny, unless someone had reported it stolen. Someone who knew her real identity. Someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was doing. Now they were searching her car, and she was calculating every single move. She couldn't blow her cover, not even with handcuffs cutting into her wrists. There were 8 months of undercover work at stake, Federal cases that could crumble if Rachel Thompson suddenly became FBI agent Joan Washington. Months of evidence that could disappear. Vincent Torres could walk free. And an entire drug network could scatter to the wind. But Malcolm was getting more aggressive by the minute, making comments that were burning themselves into everyone's memory. "I bet you stole this car from some white woman," he said, loud enough for bystanders to hear as he pressed her against the pavement. "Your kind always thinks you can just take what doesn't belong to you." "I'm not resisting," she managed to say through gritted teeth. But Malcolm just pressed harder. "Shut up. You ran a red light, you're driving a stolen vehicle, and now you're gonna learn what happens when you mess with us." Her face was burning against the hot pavement, and people started to gather, pulling out phones, recording this humiliation. In their eyes, she was just another black woman getting what they probably thought she deserved. They saw her expensive clothes, her BMW, her jewelry, and they'd already written her story. Drug dealer, criminal, someone who got too big for her britches. If they only knew. Her name was Agent Joan Washington, and for 8 months she'd been living the most dangerous lie of her career. She'd been deep undercover, infiltrating a drug ring that had been poisoning communities across 3 states. She'd risked everything, her life, her sanity, her soul, to bring down monsters who thought they were untouchable. But right then, with her cheek pressed against that asphalt and those handcuffs cutting into her flesh, none of that mattered. Right then, she was just another black woman being destroyed by cops who thought they knew exactly who she was. Officer Johnson, Malcolm's partner, looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot, but he didn't intervene. He didn't speak up. He just watched as Malcolm systematically humiliated her in front of a growing crowd of onlookers. Joan was running scenarios in her head like a chess player, thinking 10 moves ahead. If she revealed her identity now, Torres would escape. The dirty cops in this department stayed hidden. 8 months of work disappeared, and communities kept getting poisoned by fentanyl. But if she didn't reveal who she was about to be booked into county jail on felony charges, and there was no guarantee her handler would be able to extract her before her entire cover story fell apart. If you were in Joan's shoes, what would you have done? Would you expose your cover to save yourself, or would you have stayed undercover and face extreme racism? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories like this. Then something happened that made everyone's blood run cold. Malcolm was in her car compartment, and he was placing something inside that wasn't there before. Something small, something wrapped in plastic. He was planting evidence. This wasn't just racial profiling anymore. This was a deliberate frame job. That's when everything clicked into place, and Joan realized what was really happening. Malcolm kept checking his phone between searches, typing quick messages. He wasn't reporting to dispatch. He was reporting to someone else. Someone who'd been waiting for this moment. He found the planted evidence, a small bag of what looked like cocaine, and held it up like he'd just discovered buried treasure. "Well, well, well," he said with a triumphant grin. "What do we have here?" But Joan was watching Johnson's face, and she could see genuine surprise in his eyes. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Johnson didn't know about the planted drugs. This was personal between Malcolm and whoever he was working for. The pieces were falling into place now. Malcolm was the leak. He was one of Torres's cops, and somehow they'd identified Joan as federal. The fake stolen car report, the planted drugs, this aggressive stop, it was all carefully designed to get her off the streets and discredit any evidence she might have gathered. They thought they had her cornered. They thought they'd won. But there was something they didn't know. Something Joan hadn't told anyone, not even her handler, Agent Davis. For weeks she'd been recording everything. Every conversation, every meeting, every interaction. The wire she was wearing wasn't FBI standard issue. It was her personal insurance policy, because she'd learned a long time ago that in this job, you couldn't trust anyone to have your back except yourself. And right then, that wire was capturing every word of this conversation, every racist comment, every piece of planted evidence. Malcolm thought he was destroying her case, but what he was actually doing was building the case that was going to destroy him. He just didn't know it yet. "Officer Malcolm," Joan said, her voice steady despite the handcuffs cutting deep into her wrists, "I need you to look very carefully at what's in my wallet." He laughed, a cruel sound that cut through everyone watching like a blade. "Oh, now you want to talk? Now you want to cooperate?" He spat near her face, close enough that she could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "What's in there? Your welfare card? Your food stamp benefits? Let me guess, you're gonna tell me you're some kind of businesswoman, right?" The crowd that had gathered was getting bigger, phones out, recording everything. You could hear their murmurs, their assumptions. "She must have done something," one voice said. "They don't just pull people over for nothing. If they only knew." Malcolm started to dismiss her with a wave of his hand, but something in her tone stopped him cold. Maybe it was the confidence that she hadn't lost despite everything he'd put her through. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't begging or pleading like he expected. Maybe it was because she was looking him dead in the eye like she knew something he didn't. "Look at the wallet, Officer Malcolm," she repeated, and this time there was steel in her voice that made him pause. He opened it, still smirking, still performing for the crowd. "Let's see what kind of scam you're running," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably got fake credit cards in here, fake IDs. Your kind always has some kind of hustle going." He rifled past the credit cards, the grocery store receipts, the business cards that made up Rachel Thompson's carefully constructed life. His fingers were rough, careless, treating her belongings like garbage. Then his fingers found it. The badge. The federal credentials that were about to change everything. Everyone watched his face transform in real time. The color drained from his cheeks like someone just pulled a plug. His hand started shaking as he read the words that were about to end his career and possibly his freedom. The smirk disappeared. The confidence evaporated. For the first time since this started, Officer Malcolm looked scared. "Special Agent Joan Washington, FBI," she said clearly, loud enough for his body camera to catch every single word, loud enough for every phone in that crowd to record. "Badge number 3847. I've been undercover for 8 months investigating Vincent Torres and police corruption in this department. You just planted evidence on a federal agent while under active surveillance." The crowd went silent. Phones were still recording, but the whispers stopped. Johnson immediately stepped back, his hands raised like he was surrendering to an invisible army. "I didn't know," Johnson was saying, his voice cracking with panic. "I swear to God, I didn't know. Malcolm, you told me this was routine. You said she was a drug dealer. You said she was dangerous." But Malcolm wasn't backing down. He couldn't. He was in too deep now, too compromised, too invested in this lie to turn back. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out of the hole he'd dug himself into. "This is fake," he said, but his voice was shaking so hard he could barely get the words out. "You're lying. This is some kind of trick. These badges, you can buy them online. This is probably some sovereign citizen bullshit." He was getting desperate now, and desperate people do dangerous things. You could see it in his eyes. He was calculating whether he could make this all disappear. Whether he could claim she attacked him, whether he could say she was resisting arrest, whether he could spin this story in a way that saved his skin. But Joan wasn't the same woman who was face down on that pavement 30 minutes earlier. Now she was Agent Joan Washington, and she'd been building cases against men like him for over a decade. "Officer Malcolm," she said, letting each word hang in the air like a death sentence. "You've been texting Vincent Torres our location for the past 20 minutes. You reported that you had the federal bitch in custody. You told him the problem was handled. Did you really think we didn't know?" His face went completely white. The phone in his hand might as well have been a smoking gun. He looked around wildly, like he was looking for an escape route, but there was nowhere to run. The crowd was bigger now, and they were all watching him fall apart in real time. "You see," Joan continued, standing up straighter despite the handcuffs still cutting into her wrists, "the thing about being undercover is that you learn to expect the unexpected. You learn to plan for contingencies. You learn that the most dangerous people are often the ones who are supposed to protect you." Johnson was backing away from his partner now. realizing that he'd been used, that he'd been made complicit in something that was about to destroy both their careers. "Malcolm, what is she talking about?" Johnson asked, his voice shaking. "What does she mean about texting Taurus? What did you get me involved in?" But Malcolm was still trying to play it off, still trying to maintain control. "She's lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's a criminal trying to get out of trouble. Don't you see what she's doing? She's trying to confuse us, trying to make us doubt ourselves." That's when Joan smiled for the first time since this nightmare started. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. "Officer Malcolm," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd, "would you like me to recite the text messages you sent to Taurus? Because I have them all recorded. I cloned his phone so I can see all his messages. Every single one, including the one where you called me a uppity N-word who needed to be taught a lesson." The crowd gasped. Someone in the background shouted, "Oh hell no." Another voice said, "Are you recording this? Please tell me you're recording this." Malcolm's face was bright red now, a mixture of rage and fear and humiliation. "You can't prove anything," he snarled. "You're just a lying." "A lying what?" Joan interrupted, her voice cutting through his attempt to deflect. "Go ahead, Officer Malcolm. Finish that sentence. Tell this crowd exactly what you think of women who look like me. Tell them what you really think about black women who don't know their place." He was trapped now, and he knew it. Every word out of his mouth was being recorded by dozens of phones. Every racist comment, every piece of evidence he planted, every moment of corruption was being preserved for posterity. "You were so confident 20 minutes ago," Joan continued, her voice steady and professional despite the rage that must have been burning in her chest. "You were so sure you knew exactly who I was. You saw a black woman in an expensive car and you wrote my entire story before you even approached my window. Drug dealer, criminal, someone who needed to be put in her place." Johnson was openly crying now, realizing that his career was over, that he'd been used as a pawn in something much bigger and more corrupt than he ever imagined. "I didn't know," he kept repeating. "I swear I didn't know what he was doing. I just thought we were making a routine stop." But Joan wasn't done with Malcolm yet. 8 months of undercover work, 8 months of building relationships and gathering evidence, 8 months of being someone she wasn't. All of it almost destroyed by a corrupt cop who couldn't see past his own prejudices. "You know what the saddest part is?" she said, looking directly at him. "You're not even a good corrupt cop. You're sloppy, you're obvious, and you're about to bring down an entire network because you couldn't keep your racism in check for one traffic stop." That's when the cavalry arrived. 6 squad cars screeched to a halt around them. But these weren't local police. These were federal agents, Joan's colleagues, her backup that had been waiting in the wings for exactly this moment. Her handler, Agent Davis, stepped out of the first car, followed by agents she'd worked with for years, agents who knew exactly who she was and what she'd been doing for the past 8 months. The look of relief on Davis's face told everyone everything they needed to know. They'd been monitoring this situation from the beginning. "Agent Washington," Davis said, his voice carrying the authority of the federal government. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Joan said, though you could see the cuts on her wrists where the handcuffs had been digging in. "But Officer Malcolm here has some explaining to do." Malcolm was in federal custody before he could even think about deleting the incriminating messages on his phone. Every text to Taurus, every piece of coordination, every moment of corruption was preserved as evidence that was going to put him away for a very long time. The agents were professional, efficient, and respectful. Everything that Malcolm and his department had failed to be. They treated Joan like the federal agent she was, not like the criminal Malcolm had assumed she was. Johnson was cooperating immediately, admitting that he suspected something was wrong but was too scared to speak up. "I knew the car report seemed fishy," he was telling the federal agents. "I knew we shouldn't have been planting evidence. But Malcolm said it was just to make sure we got her for something. He said she was dangerous, that she was part of Taurus's operation." The planted evidence was tested on the spot and came back as baking soda. just baking soda. A pathetic attempt to frame a federal agent that was now going to add evidence tampering to Malcolm's growing list of federal charges. As they were processing the scene, you could hear Malcolm still trying to justify his actions, still trying to make excuses. She was acting suspicious, he was telling anyone who would listen. She fit the profile. How was I supposed to know she was a Fed? But nobody was buying it anymore. The crowd that gathered to watch Joan's humiliation was now watching his downfall. The phones that recorded her brutalization were now recording his arrest. The narrative had completely flipped. Joan's 8 months of undercover work was completely intact. Every piece of evidence she gathered, every conversation she recorded, every connection she made, it was all still valid. They had everything they needed to bring down Torres and his entire network of corrupt cops. But as she stood there with her badge finally visible, surrounded by federal agents who respected her and knew her worth, she was thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about how close she came to becoming another statistic. Another black woman brutalized by police, with no one to believe her story, no one to care about her truth. The only thing that saved her was a badge that most people who look like her would never have. A badge that shouldn't have been necessary to make these officers see her as human. If you've ever wanted to see what it looks like when someone's entire world collapses because of their own prejudices, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because this is exactly what justice looks like. And let us know, have you ever had a moment where you revealed something that completely changed how someone saw you? Drop a comment and tell us about it, because this moment became legendary. 3 weeks later, Vincent Torres was arrested along with 5 corrupt officers who had been feeding him information for years. Officer Malcolm got 15 years for drug trafficking, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. His police career was over, his pension was gone, and his reputation was destroyed. Joan returned to her real life, her real name, her real identity. Agent Joan Washington, not Rachel Thompson. But she kept thinking about that moment on the asphalt, feeling those handcuffs cutting into her skin, hearing those words, "You people always think you're above the law." The badge saved her. The badge gave her power that changed everything in an instant. But it shouldn't have taken a badge to make her human. It shouldn't have taken federal credentials to make those officers see her as someone deserving of basic respect and dignity. And that's the part of this story that haunts everyone the most. Because for every Joan Washington with a badge, there are thousands of women who look like her, who don't have that protection, who don't have that power, who can't flash credentials that will make the handcuffs disappear and the racism stop. The system worked for her because she was part of the system. But what about everyone else? What about the women who look like her, who don't have badges, who don't have federal backup, who don't have the power to make corrupt cops face consequences for their actions? That's the question that should keep us all up at night. That's the question that should drive us to keep fighting, to keep believing that maybe someday a badge won't be necessary to make someone see your humanity. Because until that day comes, stories like Joan's will keep happening. And the only difference between her and the women who don't make it home is a piece of metal and leather in a wallet. If you want to hear more stories about justice, corruption, and what happens when people's assumptions get shattered, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it.